Thank you very much for coming to this event this evening. Usually, a speaker would begin his talk by saying, "It's a pleasure to be here," or "I'm so happy to speak to you on this topic." But I don't think I want to use this opening line tonight because the topic that we are going to talk about is a very heavy, as Samson said, a very heavy topic. And I don't consider it a pleasure to be here. In fact, I would just say it is timely for us to pause and consider some of the things that I'm going to talk about this evening. Let me just first make sure that everyone on the same page. Tonight, I'm not going to talk about who's right or who's wrong. Right? And tonight, I'm not going to talk about inter-group conflict. That is, how are we going to resolve conflicts between the police and the protesters? How are we going to resolve the conflict between the government and Hong Kong people? How are we going to resolve the conflict between the white shirt guy and the black shirt guy? All right, so this is not the focus for tonight. The focus of tonight is very, very narrow. That is, we are going to talk about interpersonal conflicts as a result of the social chaos in the last few months. In the last few months, let's start with some people's emotions, right? So we have our emotions as a result of watching news, okay? So we see news, we see horrible pictures and images on social media and TV. And as soon as we watch those things, we become angry, you become upset. And usually, when we feel that way, we talk to some people, right? And so we also feel upset when we hear or see people saying nonsense in front of a TV camera. Several times I wanted to turn off my TV because that person there was talking nonsense. And we also feel bad when we hear friends and relatives make comments that are clearly untrue. They were based on fake news that are based on misinformation. So when we hear people talk about those things, then we are unhappy. So we have been unhappy for several months. And how do we deal with this kind of unhappiness? Well, we deal with this sense of injustice and unhappiness by talking to someone, right? So if you've seen something unpleasant, then probably you will talk to someone. And then if you have social gatherings with your friends, or colleagues, or former colleagues, or your relatives, your family members, then you talk about, you air your displeasure. And when you talk about those things, we say something from our hearts. We talk about our feelings, and sometimes these people don't share our feelings. These people simply don't share our feelings. And so we engage in some rational and calm discussion because that person does not share the same feelings. So that person is probably misled by something, and we have pity on that person. So we share information with that person. So we start sending video to that person on WhatsApp, and we start sharing Facebook messages with that person. The person whom we talk to is also thinking that way. But the person also feels that you have been misinformed, and so that person will send you videos and other messages. So there is an exchange of information. And in this exchange of information, probably people are not persuaded. Even though our intention is to persuade the other person, that person is not persuaded. So we see people who disagree with us, and we'll come to a conclusion that that person has no sense of justice. You give that person all the video, all the facts, that person simply would not want to believe it. Now, how could a person who is educated be so misled? So the person is just calling a deer a horse. And the person who calls a deer a horse is someone who has no conscience. A person who is without a sense of conscience. So not only that person has no sense of justice and conscience, the person also did something wrong to me. In exchange, in the discussion with that person, when we need to share our very deep and disturbed feelings, we expect that person to empathize with us, but the person would not empathize with us. The person would probably say that we are wrong. And both parties become more and more emotional, and then we have things, we call each other a hypocrite. You said you're honest, but you are now spreading fake news and bearing false witnesses. Well, you could call the other person liar, and on the online, then we unfriend them. Offline, in families, we kick our kids out of the family. So we see people being estranged from others. Now, when we find people who do not have a sense of justice sitting around us, and when we see those people who have done something wrong to me by calling me a hypocrite or an idiot, or excluding me from their social network, there is a strong sense of injustice within us. And this strong sense of injustice would generate a desire to restore justice. Okay, so a sense of injustice within our heart is some kind of motivator that will motivate us to restore justice, to restore the sense of justice. And so we plan a revenge, we do not make concessions, and these are some of the things that we would do to our relatives, to our loved ones. Of course, people are more violent when they engage in what Hong Kong people now call, pardon me for using this Cantonese term, 私了, that is, taking justice in their own hands without help from the law enforcing agency. Now, even if you do not desire to actively restore justice, sometimes you have passive pleasure. You have pleasure. You find pleasure to see justice restored. For example, if someone who has upset you, got fired from his job, you secretly find it pleasurable. You would say, there is a God. You believe that justice is finally done. So I have to confess that once I saw something on TV, I actually felt quite pleasant. So that is the situation. People are estranged from each other. We have to look at this from a more psychological perspective. Again, as I said early on, I'm not going to talk about how we are going to mend the ribs in Hong Kong. I'm going to talk about only the interpersonal conflicts that many of us are suffering through. And in order to do that, I have to introduce the three concepts. Reconciliation is the word used in tonight's topic. But I would also like to mention two concepts, apology and forgiveness. And these two concepts could be considered as preconditions for reconciliation. Now, just very briefly, what is reconciliation? Reconciliation is the return to the original state of relationship prior to the conflict of transgression. So if a husband and wife got separated, and reconciliation means that they move in back together. Okay. So if two friends have been meeting for monthly dinner dates, and they haven't been doing this since June, and they decide to do it again, then that is reconciliation. So reconciliation is the return to the original state of relationship prior to the conflict or transgression. Another term, apology. Some people consider that these three terms closely related to each other, but we do have to distinguish between the three. Apology is an action. Apology is an action. X-Line is someone who have done a lot of research in the psychology of apology, how people make apology, how people give apology, and how people receive apologies. And X-Line defines apology as an acknowledgement of the wrongfulness of an act, an admission of responsibility, and an expression of remorse, repentance, and a sense of being humbled. So an apology, according to X-Line and quite a few others, includes some actions. The action includes acknowledging the wrongfulness of an act, I have done something wrong. Secondly, to admit that I am responsible for that event. And thirdly, an expression of remorse, feeling bad about that and feeling humbled. Okay, so this is how the word apology has been used. And this definition is very close to the legal definition adopted in many countries, many jurisdictions, legal system. Well, I noticed that many of you would like to take pictures, and if you discover that the pictures that you have taken is not good enough, at the bottom of the first page of your handout, you can find my email address. I'll be happy to share with you my PowerPoint. All right, so let's move on to the third concept, forgiveness. Forgiveness is a mental state, so it happens inside you, okay? People might not be able to see that forgiveness has taken place. What is forgiveness? Worthington is a very famous psychologist who has been working on this topic for 20 years. He recently retired. Worthington defined forgiveness as relinquishing resentment despite the injustice one has experienced. So you feel angry, resentful, after being wronged, after being transgressed upon, but you give that resentment up. Okay, so that is Worthington's definition. So it is a mental state. Okay? It is a mental state inside you. Somebody defined forgiveness as Worthington did, but added something to it. Unright said that forgiveness is willingness to abandon one's right to resentment, negative judgment, and indifferent behavior. So this is the abandonment or the relinquishing of the resentment. But it also includes fostering the undeserved qualities of compassion, generosity, and even love towards the offender. So to this group of researchers, forgiveness is becoming more loving towards the person who transgressed upon you. In any case, we notice that forgiveness is widely defined as a mental state. We feel the disappearance of resentment and anger. Right? And forgiveness is something that the person can actively do. Right, so I've talked about three things: reconciliation, apology, and forgiveness. Then let's talk about the relationship among these three things. What are the relationships between apology, forgiveness, and reconciliation? I used a table to describe four different possibilities or four different scenarios. In scenario A, the offender apologized and the victim forgave. So the offender apologized and the victim forgave, and reconciliation is possible. I said possible. I did not say that it will necessarily happen. Okay, so this is the condition for reconciliation to happen. That is, apology has taken place and forgiveness has also taken place, and then reconciliation is possible. And we would also want to see this possibility. However, there is another scenario in which the offender apologized while the victim, the offended, would not forgive. Now, when this happens, then there is no possibility of reconciliation. Okay? That is, the victim refuses to be reconnected to the offender. It would be something like, a man who cheated on his wife apologized, and then the wife refused to forgive, and so their marriage could not be saved. A third situation is when the offender does not apologize, and yet the victim would forgive. Okay? This is a rare case, but this could happen. And if that happened, reconciliation is still not possible because the offender is not prepared to repent and to change. And so it would be a big risk to the victim to be reconnected to the offender. And finally, if the offender would not apologize and if the victim would not forgive, then in fact the two persons are in a very hostile relationship to each other. And of course, reconciliation is not possible. So in all these four scenarios, there's only one scenario in which reconciliation is possible. And the other three, we cannot expect reconciliation. So imagine that you are a victim, and if you are a victim, then you are willing to forgive, then there is this possibility. And yet, if the offender does not repent, then the relationship will not be rebuilt. So the next question is, if we want reconciliation so bad, then we will want people to be willing to apologize and people to be willing to forgive. If you are the person who is wronged, and you would hope that the other person, the person who offended you, would apologize. Because if that person does not apologize, then the two of you are still in a very tense relationship. Then the question is, why don't people apologize? Okay. Why don't people apologize? X-Line again. X-Line said that there are a number of reasons. The first and foremost reason is pride and fear of shame. Okay? Because of the pride, you just cannot say that I am wrong. Okay? This word is so difficult to say it out of your mouth. And this fear of shame is the thing that prevents a person from apologizing. And it is quite true that the more powerful is the person, the less likely is the person to apologize, because the person is so afraid of being put in a shameful situation. A second reason why people don't apologize is the fear of restrictions associated with confession. Imagine that you are a man who has drinking problem, and now you have to apologize to your wife, saying that, honey, I'm not going, I'm sorry for what I've done before, I'm sorry for my abusive behaviors, please forgive me. So if you said that, in fact, you are committing yourself to not to drink again. Are you sure that you want to do it? So people are afraid of restrictions associated with confessions. And the third reason is the fear of the apology being used against oneself. But the more important reason is this. That is, the person who has offended someone actually and honestly believes that the accusation is false. Okay. There is this honest disagreement that, no, I didn't do anything wrong, or I didn't do things that wrong. People will say something like, the offense was unintended. I didn't intend to do it. So if it is unintentional, then I may not have to apologize. Or the offense was an isolated incident. Or the offense was not serious. Or the person might say, I have been reasonable all the time. In fact, I am the true victim. So I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do many bad things. In fact, I am the true victim. Or I have already apologized, or I've already repented. So this is, I'm saying this not because these people use these words, these sentences as their excuse. People do truly believe that, and we have to respect these people. People do truly believe that their so-called offense is not that serious, or those are just isolated incidents, or those things are not intended. Right, let's now move on to the question of, then why don't people forgive? Right? So we know and we kind of understand why people don't apologize. Then why don't people forgive? Studies have shown that the more wounded you are psychologically, the less likely you are willing to forgive. So there is a causal relationship between these two. So a person who is only, if the wound or the injury is minor, then probably forgiveness is easier. If somebody stepped on your toes, this is a minor thing, then forgiveness is easy. If somebody did something wrong to your leg and that results in an amputation, that is serious, and forgiveness is less likely. Okay. So the intensity or the immensity of the wounds is related to forgiveness. And if the person feels hurt psychologically, then the person would not be willing to forgive. And in the last few months, we see people, very angry people, not willing to forgive. The unwillingness to forgive is because they feel so hurt, okay? The feeling of being hurt. Interestingly, research also showed that forgiveness would reduce or would heal psychological wounds. So people who forgive will also will subsequently feel less wounded. Okay, they feel being healed. Now, this is a cycle. This could be a vicious cycle, and if the vicious cycle sets in, then you could understand why the unforgiveness is going to stay for a long, long time. If you are wounded psychologically and you're unlikely or unwilling to forgive, if you don't forgive, they won't stay. They won't stay, and so you are not willing to forgive, and so it will stay there forever. If, for some reason, you bite the bullet and forgive, then the wound is partially healed, and with a smaller wound, it's easier to forgive. But if it's easier to forgive, then the wounds continue to be healed. So depending on whether you are on a vicious cycle or not, you may or may not forgive. Another reason why people don't forgive is that the apology given by the offender is not proportionate or commensurate to the injustice felt. That is, you feel so unjustly treated. And this feeling of injustice is so big that an apology given by the offender is just too small. Okay? So if someone killed your family member, and the person knocks at your door and says, "I'm sorry, I by accident killed your brother," and then walks away. No, you don't imagine yourself being willing to forgive. Okay? So if the apology given by the offender is not proportionate to the injustice felt, then people do not forgive. And there is another reason, and this reason goes something like this. There is a lingering psychological need for restoration of justice. There is this strong need within us that we believe that all unjust things should be remedied. And if there is this unjust things happening in the world, or if I were treated by someone unfairly, then there is a strong need within me to restore justice. And that's where revenge comes in. And that's what I mentioned a little while earlier. So this is how we forgive, and this is how we do not forgive. And you'll notice that I underlined the word justice or injustice, because again, justice is something that, or justice concern is something that prevents us from forgiving other people, from people who have offended us. All right, so let me now move on to onto the cognitive biases in injustice perception. As I mentioned earlier, people are unwilling to forgive, and one of the reasons is that there is this justice concern. Okay? There is this sense of injustice within them. People are unwilling to apologize because they thought that the offense was just a simple thing, and it would be unfair for you to ask for a big compensation or ask for a big apology. So, but are we sure that we have made the right judgment in our injustice perception? I'm going to share with you results from 3 different research projects. And these three research projects point at a direction that our justice perception or our injustice perception may not be accurate all the time. First, this is this memory distortion study. Let me just briefly explain what this memory distortion experiment was like. So imagine yourself being a university student, being brought into, each one of you being brought into a psychology laboratory, and you are handed a sheet of paper, a story, and then you're instructed to read through the story, okay? And the story is about a senior year university student and a freshman. The freshman needs to complete his homework, his coursework, by tomorrow morning, and the senior year person agrees to help him with that paper. But when the time comes, the senior year person did not show up, and so the freshman would have to do the coursework all by himself. Of course, he didn't do that well. And then the following morning, this person submitted his paper, and then finally he got a low grade. He would not be able to continue on in that department and would have to find another department to major in. So this is the event. The event says that no, there is an offender. The offender is the person, the senior year person, who promised to help but did not show up. The victim is the person who needed help and did not get help, right? So I mentioned that this group of people are asked to read the story from the perspective of the offender, that is, of the senior year person. Imagine yourself being that senior year student, and then you read through the story. And imagine this is the group of people asked to read the story from the perspective of the freshman. Okay? So you read the story from the perspective of the freshman. So you read through the story has all kinds of details. There are details in the story that favor the offender, that is the senior year person. For example, the offender did not mind helping initially. The offender, that is the senior year student, has forgotten about the date, and that person was on the phone with his romantic partner about the crisis in their relationship, and the offender apologized afterwards. So these details would make you feel, would favor the offender, right? To give you a better impression of the offender. Now look at the things on the right-hand side. Here are the details that favor the victim. For example, the offender showed up 2 hours late, intoxicated. So this is not a good thing. The victim, that is the freshman, has been trying to meet with that person twice more, and the course was important to the victim's major, and the victim's grade fell from B to C. So reading these kind of details would make you feel sorry for the freshman student. And all these details are mixed up in the story. Okay? So you've read this story, and after reading it, then you are asked to do something else. Okay? And then after a while, then you're brought back into the laboratory, handed a sheet of paper and a pencil, and you're told to retell the story from your memory. So can you remember what you have read? How's your memory working? So this is the experiment. So I'm going to present to you the data. Sorry for those people who do not like numbers, and if you don't like numbers, I have some inequality signs here so that to help you. But the numbers are lovely. I love numbers. Now, this group of people, the numbers on this row are people who read the story from the offender's perspective. The numbers that I'm going to show you on this row are numbers of people who read the story from the victim's, the freshman's perspective. This is the first set. Okay? Recall of details that favor the offender. Recalls of details that favor the offender. Of course, we forget many things, but if you took the offender's perspective, then you remember 2/3 of the details that favor the offender. But if you took the victim's perspective, you only remember half of the details, right? So you remember less if you did not take that person's perspective. You remember more that favors that person if you took that person's perspective. What about the victim? What's your guess? It's just the reverse. It's just the reverse. If you took the victim's perspective in reading the story, then you remember details that favors the victim, but you do not remember that much that favors the offender. Which means that when you reconstruct the story, and then when you retell the story to another person and to another person, then the story would become more and more favorable to the person whose perspective that you took at the beginning. Okay. is even though at the beginning the story was kind of, contains details that kind of favor one person over the other, then by taking the perspective of a particular person, then the story being retold will become more and more favorable toward that person. So we do not remember correctly, and especially when we take the perspective of one party in the dispute. Now, we don't simply forget about things. Sometimes when we retell stories, we add new things that do not exist. Okay? And sometimes we alter the details. And after altering those things, after adding those things, we thought we remember correctly. We all understand how our memory fails us. We open the fridge and we forget whether we are taking something out or whether we want to put something in. Right? So the same thing happened here. But we add new things. And when we add new things, we thought we are not making any mistakes. Now, if you took the offender's perspective, and then you would add 2.4 details that are favorable to the offender. Details that did not exist in the story. Okay. And you only add about half a detail that would favor the other person, that is the victim. What about the other situation? When you are the victim, again, a reverse. If you took the victim's perspective, then you add new information, untrue information, to be more favorable to the victim and not to the offender. Now, you can imagine that after this retelling of the story, then the story that you retell would be quite different from the original story that you have read. But you still truly believe that. You truly and honestly believe that this is what you have read. And that is the problem. In summary, if you took the offender's perspective, then you remember more details that favors the offender. If you took the victim's perspective, then you remember more details that favors the victim. If you took the offender's perspective, then you add new things that favors the offender. If you took the victim's perspective, then you add new things that favors the victim. And this is how our memory fails us. And so if you think that, look, the injury on me was so bad, that person has insulted me, well, you are taking a perspective of the victim. And it is quite possible that you as a victim have added new details and forgotten other details. I'm not saying that this happens only to the victims. It also happens to the offender. And the offender would embellish those information that are favorable to themselves. They will remember less of the offense, but more of their good things. The victims remember more of the seriousness of the injury, but less of the goodness of the offender. So in summary, the offender's version of the story contains emphasis or addition of offender's mitigating circumstances. That version contains more positive things the offenders did and less information about the offense. So this is the offender's version of the story. If you are asked to describe that offense, then probably you don't say much about the offense. However, the victim who is on the receiving end of the offense would remember more details of sufferings, would have fewer positive things to say about the offender, and would downplay the offender's mitigating circumstances. You would not want to help the offender. Now, one thing that is very important in this experiment is that this experiment was conducted in a university among university students. And these university students did not themselves go through the offense, right? So these students were not the person who was stood up and who could not show up in that session to help the freshmen. Okay? So the participants in this experiment were third persons. Okay? They're not involved in it. And they're university students. if a person who is not actually involved in an incident could make a mistake like that, how likely and how serious would people who are actually involved in a dispute make mistakes? Furthermore, if these 20-year-old university students could make mistakes, they are in the prime of their memory and intellectual development, how likely are we who are slightly older than those 20 years old? Let me talk about a second experiment. The data of this experiment, of this research, was collected a few years ago. I had a chance to meet with two large groups of pastors, Christians, lay leaders. So these are all Christian believers. And it went something like this. On the first day of our meeting, I asked all of them to write two stories. The two stories, the first one is a story of having hurt someone. Okay? So here is an example. Somebody wrote, I scolded a church choir member in public for her being late. And she broke down, and I was sorry about that. But actually, the story was much longer. This is just a very brief synopsis of the story. So the story had 150, 200 words. Okay. So I hurt someone. So this is one story, hurting someone. Now there is the other story. The person also wrote a story being hurt by someone. For example, a good friend of mine knew about the 3 deaths in my family, but he didn't show up at any of the funerals. I'm totally disappointed with that person. So I feel offended and devastated because of this friend of mine. Okay. So I collected hundreds of stories. The following week, I gave them a questionnaire. I gave all of these people a questionnaire and asked them to recall these two stories and to answer the questionnaire while they recall these two stories. So I heard someone, like I scolded my church choir member, or he or she hurt me, like my friend did not come to the funerals of my family members. My question was, are there any positive consequences of this event? Yes, you scolded your church choir member. Yes, somebody didn't show up in your family members' funerals. But are there positive consequences? And does the story have a happy ending? And are there negative consequences? So these are the answers that they gave on a scale from 1 to 5. Don't worry about the numbers. Just look at the inequality signs. The inequality signs are more interesting here. So if you ask people, does that have any positive consequences? The person who hurt someone actually said, well, actually there are some positive consequences. And in fact, in that person's story, he wrote that after I scolded that person and after she broke down, she was never late again. So this is a positive consequence. But if you are hurt by someone, then you will not be able to recall any positive things. So there is this difference here. Does the story have a happy ending? If I hurt someone, well, on a scale from 1 to 5, I still believe that, well, there's a 3. But if somebody hurt me, no, the story doesn't have a happy ending. You can imagine this situation. If you were late and somebody gave you a lecture and you cried out loud and you wept and you yelled and screamed, then you of course feel very bad about it. And therefore, when asked about negative consequences, and if I hurt that person, then that person who was on the receiving end would feel very bad about it. But if I hurt that person, I might not be able to tell. Imagine then after being scolded by me, that person had sleeping problems for 2 weeks. Let's just give this example. I, as the choir leader, would not be able to tell or would not know that person could not sleep for 2 weeks. So I would not know the bad consequences that I have caused. But that person who was on the receiving end of my offense, of course, would know what the negative consequences are. So the victim and the wrongdoer had very different perception of the consequences of the offense. Who's right? Who's wrong? I would say that both of them could be right. The offender saw something. The victim also saw something. Now, did the offender apologize? The offender feel remorseful? The answer is, if you are the offender, then you feel that you have already apologized. But if you are the victim, then you don't seem to remember receiving any apology from the offender. Now, back to this story about the choir leader who gave the late choir member a long lecture. Now, that choir member, that choir leader felt very bad about it after that evening. Okay? So the person actually felt remorseful. But this remorse feeling, this regret, was not known to the victim. Okay? This person only felt it in his heart. And so the choir member was not aware of that. And that's why when you are hurt, you don't recall the person who hurt you feeling remorseful. But if you have hurt someone, at least you feel that you regret the incident. Well, did you apologize? Somebody told me that if I have done something wrong, well, somebody actually did something wrong, and he said that when I saw that person again, I felt sorry, and I wanted to apologize, and when I saw him in the corridor, I smiled at him. But that person didn't notice it. So you remember yourself making an apology, but the intended recipient did not recall or did not observe your having made that apology. The third set of questions that I asked is, who started the whole thing? Who started the whole thing? Did the offender start the whole thing? Or did the victim start the whole thing? If you ask the offender, then the offender said, well, I didn't start it. If you ask the victim said, the offender started it. Okay? So the offender and the victim said different things. Whom do you believe? The offender believes in himself, but the victim also believes in himself. Okay? Both of them believe that it is the other person who started the whole incident. Think of fights in your family, or if you are married, think of fights with your spouse. Oftentimes, we feel that it is the other person who started the fight. And even if that person didn't start the fight, it is the person who caused the fight. And if you trace the root of the quarrel, then it must be the other person. It cannot be me. So when both persons think that way, then we have this set of differences. The final set of comparison is interesting, and I would like you to take note of that. Even if you forget all about these numbers, there are two numbers that I would like you to remember. These two numbers are what I'm going to show to you. I asked these people, what do you think is the share of responsibility? What do you think is the offender's share of the responsibility? So assuming that there is this 100% thing, and you, as an offender, how responsible are you for it? And you, as a victim, how responsible are you for it? So we are talking about the attribution of responsibilities. Now, these people, after reflections upon the whole event, would feel that they might be responsible, but let us look at the numbers. The offender feel that he or she is responsible for 51%. Okay, so it's half of it. So there is this fight between us, or there is this offense. I feel responsible. The offender feels responsible, and he feels 51% responsible. But if you ask the victim, what is the offender's share? The victim says 70. Now, the difference between these numbers is very important, and it has very important implications when we make our apology or when we make compensations. And imagine that this offender, who after reflecting upon the whole thing, feels that he or she is responsible for 51% of the whole event. Or assume that you feel that you owe that person, you owe the victim 51 units of compensation. Do you want to bring $51,000 back to that person or something like that? Or if this is psychological hurt, maybe you want to apologize 51 times or making 51 bows to that person. And remember, making an apology is shameful, okay? People don't like to do it. But if you feel that you are truly, truly sorry for what you have done, then you still would have to do it. Imagine that you as an offender now walks to this victim's home and say to this victim, I'm sorry, I've done something wrong on that night. I scolded you because you were late. If I'm truly, truly sorry. And I'm going to bow to you 51 times or to bring you $51,000 or whatever, okay? Roses. Or 51 roses. Yeah, that is a good point. You offended your wife and then you feel that the whole thing, you owe your wife 51 roses. And then you go there and deliver 1 rose or 1 bow, 2 roses, a second rose, and a second bow. And of course, it's hard on you. Yes, I know that buying roses is not that, it's not that expensive. It is not on Valentine's Day. But still, giving this compensation is something that is costly, psychologically costly. And you feel that it is only fair that you apologize. And you being a good husband or being a good choir leader, you have to apologize. You have to make compensation fairly. So you bring this 51 units of compensation to the person whom you offended. So you bring this 51 units of compensation to this person, or apologize 51 times, or bow 51 times, and after you have made that final 51st bow, you stood straight, hoping that the victim that you offended will forgive. What do you think the victim will do?
You still owe that 170
Yeah, the victim is expecting 71. The victim is expecting 71. And you gave only 50. And so your apology or your compensation would be regarded as insincere, inadequate, and certainly unjust. You have already treated that person unfairly and unjustly, and now you are treating the person unjustly again. Now, if that person said this to you, look, no, you don't owe me 51, you owe me 70. How would you feel? You have already...
Don't fear fuss.
You feel equally bad. How could this person be so unreasonable? I owe this person only 51 units of apology or whatever, and this person is asking me for 70. How dare you? So, we could not resolve this problem here. There is this big dilemma. And this big dilemma is because we have very different perception of our share in our responsibility. Even if you are doing this in very good intention, I'm afraid that this is not the way to go. So let me just try to summarize what we have covered here. Victims and wrongdoers differ in injustice perception. We simply are different. We differ in our perception of the consequences of event. One person believes that the consequences of the event is very bad, while the other one perceives it as not so bad. And we differ in perception on whether an adequate apology has been made. We also differ on how responsibilities should be attributed. Okay? So in addition to the original differences in opinions that you have offended me or I have offended you, we have a new set of disagreements. And this new set of disagreement only add to the already bad relationship between these two persons. Let me talk about the third experiment. we are not so good in assessing what is fair. Okay? Being human beings, being fallen human beings, we're not so good in assessing what is fair. Now, in this experiment, there are two players or two participants. The two persons will sit in front of each other. They don't know each other. And player one, who is on the left on the screen, puts his left index finger under a little machine that will generate a small amount of force. Okay? So it's 0.25 Newton of force. That force will press on this person's left index finger. This player one would have to remember how strong that force was, and then use his right index finger to press on the other side, which is connected to a force connected to the player's two's index finger, and the machine would measure how strongly player one would apply the force. So your finger is applied a small amount of force. Remember it. Apply the same amount of force into the other person. Okay, and that person would have to remember how strong that force is, and then use his right hand finger to press on your finger. So this will go in several turns. Okay? So if you are accurate, then if you receive 0.25 newtons of force, then you apply maybe 0.25 or 0.26 newtons of force to the other person. The person remembers what that 0.25 newtons of force is, and then the person would use his right hand finger to do it, and then you use the right hand finger to do it, and back and forth. This is the experiment design. You know what they find? This red line is 0.25 Newton. But after a few turns, it goes from 0.25 all the way up to 5 or 4 or 5 newtons. What we are seeing here is that you are told to remember the physical force on the finger, and then apply the same amount of physical force on the other person. And you failed it. Okay? Such a simple task. Remember the intensity of a physical force, and applying the same to the other person. Would it be easier or harder if we have to remember the amount of psychological wound that someone did to us, and then say, I'm going to get even with you, real even, exactly even with you, and apply the same amount of psychological wound on you so that we can get even? Probably we won't be able to do that. We'll end up something like this. Okay? So we have a very inaccurate assessment of what is fair, even though we believe that we know what is fair. We trust in our conscience, we have trust in our sense of justice, and we know that the other person has done something wrong, but probably we are wrong. So what are the implications? What are the implications of these three experiments? Well, firstly, I'm afraid to say that restoration of justice to both persons' satisfaction is quite difficult. If a compensation is fair, if a compensation looks fair to the victim, it would not look fair to the offender. If a compensation looks fair to the offender, it would look so thin to the victim. So restoration of justice to both persons' satisfaction is very difficult. Secondly, I'll forgive after justice is restored. It's probably an unachievable dream. If justice is restored, if your justice is restored, that means the other person feels that some injustice has been done on that person, and that person will not forgive. So waiting until justice is restored before you forgive is probably unrealistic. So can we have both justice and reconciliation? I'm saying this, I'm talking about this at an interpersonal level. I don't know the answer for the societal level. But from a psychologist's perspective, if we want to reconcile with someone we love, then probably we would not be able to achieve justice, our justice, at the same time. If we want our justice done, then we probably would have to forego reconciliation, and we cannot have the best of both worlds. Then, what could we do? Now, I don't want to end this talk without speaking on some positive things. I don't want to leave you feeling that, all right, so we'll continue the fight. The fight is on. We can still facilitate reconciliation. We can still do it. Knowing about our human limitations, our human biases in understanding what justice is, then perhaps there could be 4 steps to facilitate reconciliation. And I use these 4 letters, F, A, F. The first one is focus. The first F is focus on only a few important relationships. What are those important relationships? Those relationships that are more important than my justice concern. There must be some people in your life who are more important than so-called justice, your justice. And we focus on those. There may be other people who are not as important, maybe colleagues whom you might not see after a year or 2, maybe friends whom you do not meet frequently. But there must be someone who have had good relationship with you, whom you have cared for a long, long time, who is your family member. So are there someone who are more important than justice concern, that you are willing to lay aside your concern for justice and try to attempt reconciliation? So this is the first F. The second, A, apologize. We talk about apology, right? Apologize and making compensation. We all know that we've been taught to give apology. A couple of years ago, Hong Kong government has this apology ordinance. So apology is important, and we all know about this. We are not that good in making apologies, but apology is one important step towards reconciliation. Apologize and make compensation. But on the basis of the 3 experiments that I told you, simply apologizing will not be enough, because you will have to apologize more than what you think is fair and adequate. Remember that 2 numbers? 51 and 70. If you feel that it is good enough for you to apologize, then add about 40% more to it. So apologize and make compensations. Now this is a tall order. This is not easy. Asking you or asking me to apologize is already a difficult thing. Or agreeing to apologize is a difficult thing. And agreeing to give more compensation is much more difficult. But let's give it a try if we want reconciliation. If that person, if that relationship is that important. The other A is accept apology. Yes, of course, we accept apology. But this time, on the basis of the 3 experiments I told you, we do not just accept apology. We will have to understand that the person who gave apology, who made an apology, even though is doing this in his best intention, the person might not have made the adequate apology according to my standard. Okay? I expect 70, but that person would only make 51. So there is a difference here. So if that person is short on apology, then we'll have to accept it. We still would have to accept it. We accept apology even though the apology seems inadequate. I'm not saying that you go out and accept apology from everybody, because not everybody is equally important to you. But for those people who are important to you, we'll have to consider this. We accept apology that seems inadequate. And finally, forgive. The very commonly used word, forgive. Forgive, and if you remember, at the beginning, I defined forgiveness as willing to lay aside the resentment. That is, giving up the right to be angry. Giving up the right to be angry and to forgive. Remember this cycle that I showed you earlier? I said that forgiveness is not easy because if you have been wounded so much, then this psychological wound would inhibit you from forgiving another person. However, the good news is that forgiveness can heal psychological wounds. And if we let forgiveness reign in our heart, then one day the psychological wounds could be healed. This is a bold step to take, but this is a step that is based on strong empirical research evidence. Okay? So if you're willing to forgive, then the wounds are healed. And this is something that social scientists would tell you. So let me just repeat what the 4 steps are. Focus on only a few important relationships because you don't have that much energy to forgive so many people, to apologize to so many people. Rebuilding a relationship with one person already takes up a lot of your time. So don't expect yourself to be a saint forgiving everybody. Apologize, and apologize more than what you think you owe the person. Accept apology, and accept apology that seems inadequate to you. So this is not just some religious cliche. It is important because it is supported by some empirical data. And finally, forgive. To give up the right to be angry, to give up the right to be resentful, and that will facilitate reconciliation. I say it will only facilitate. I do not guarantee reconciliation. The reason being that reconciliation requires the person who was offended to forgive, and requires the person who offended the other person to apologize. But in a lot of disputes, in a lot of interpersonal conflicts, both persons consider themselves to be the victim. And so, both persons would have to forgive. And since both persons consider themselves to be victims, that means both persons expect the other person to apologize. And so, unless both persons are willing to apologize and forgive, reconciliation would not occur. However, if you have done these 4 steps, then you have done half of it. You have done your part, and we wait for the other person to do the other half. We can only facilitate reconciliation, and we cannot guarantee it. But at least we can see some light at the end of the tunnel. So with this, let me end this talk, and I hope that if we want to start the process, don't just let it stay in your head. Perhaps we can start this facilitation of reconciliation now, perhaps tonight. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hui, for your sharing. It's really insightful. And my question is when you said you encourage people to be the one who initiate to forgive, in your experience, is it just a matter of choice of the person, or in your experience, is there something that actually would help someone to able to do that? Because doing forgiveness voluntarily is not as easy. So is there anything in your experience that actually could help the person to do it, to able to actually do it, or it's just like a will, you make a choice and then...
So your question is, why should I forgive? Right?
Yeah.
So can we say something to encourage people to forgive? I could offer 2 reasons. And the first reason is for health reasons. And the second, myself being a Christian believer, I could offer a religious motivation. Okay, let me talk about the first one first. Forgiving people helps our psychological and our physical health. And if you believe in that, then you will certainly want to do it. Studies have shown that people who forgive are healthier, physically healthier on some physiological measures. Forgiveness would lead to positive evaluation of life. This is a study done on people who were bullied. Forgiveness would lead to subjective health. That is, you not only are healthier, but you feel healthier. And fourthly, forgiveness would lead to reduced marital conflicts. Okay? So these are some of the psychological, social benefits of forgiveness. So if you like some of the outcomes, then perhaps that is an impetus for you to forgive. This is a study of a physiological study of forgiveness. The study was conducted in a laboratory where people were hooked on, where there were wires and hooked up on the person. And then the person was asked to recall one event that he or she had been wrongfully dealt with. So an event that he was offended, he was transgressed upon. And then while the person is recalling that thing, the person was also told to, number one, to think of the hurt that he or she has experienced. Or number two, to think of the grudges, to hold on to some grudge. Or another group of people were told to empathize with the person who inflicted pain on you. And the fourth group of people were told to forgive, to think forgiveness. Okay, so you're simply trying to recall the event. You think forgiveness, and the x-axis, the horizontal axis, shows the time in blocks of 5 seconds. And the measure, and this is a measurement of your heart rate. What it shows is that as soon as you are told to recall an event that you offended, that you were transgressed upon, then your heart rate would go up. But if you were told to recall that event and to hold some grudge, then your heart rate will go up to by 2.5 beats per minute. However, if you are told to be empathized or to forgive the person, then your heart rate will go up for only 1 beat per second. That is, your heart rate will not be affected that much, even if you remember the things that somebody did to you. Okay, and imagine that this is only for 20 seconds, and this is the recovery when you do not have to think about that thing. So the heart rate would drop, return to normal. Now, if you think of that thing for a long, long time, and if you have been doing it all day long, that means your heart rate will be kept at an elevated level. You don't like that, okay? So forgive. Here's another. This is your blood pressure. The same thing. If you maintain this grudge or this hurt inside you, then your blood your blood pressure would go up by about 2.5 cm. Okay, and well, of course, 2.5 cm mercury is not a big deal if this happens only for half an hour. But if it is extended, then that is a problem. So one benefit of forgiveness is the social, psychological part, the familial part. If you like living longer, then forgive.
Thank you, Dr. Hui. I think the answer is very clear.
Thank you very much.
The second question, please.
Good evening, doctor. My question is that since we are talking about forgiveness tonight, but I feel like in real life there is another way, like the victim, he wants to revenge. So my question is, do you think doing revenge is a kind of justice? And furthermore, so we are talking about the inequality of the victims and the offenders, their perspective on the justice. So I feel like in real life, when the victim is doing some revenge, do you think sometimes they are doing over-revenging? So that's my 2 questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if I can answer all of them, but let me briefly respond to that. Revenge is something that may not be desirable, both at a societal level and at a psychological level. At a psychological level, revenge can never be fair, as I mentioned in my talk, because applying the right amount of revenge so that it is fair is difficult, if not impossible. So if you revenge and if you over-revenge a little bit, then this would be perceived by the person who were originally an offender, and now the person feels that he is now being victimized. And now, so he has the right to revenge. And when he was doing this thing back to you, and these things go on, and that will see the escalation of animosity and revenge.
So are you saying that we can revenge, but not revenge as expected as we want to do? So do you think that legal revenge is acceptable?
So your question is, can we revenge, right? You're asking me, okay, now, my answer to you is, if we have a just judicial system, then perhaps the judge sitting in a court of law will be able to apply perhaps something fair to the person who was the victim. But we, being the victim ourselves, are so affected by our emotion, as we could see in the first, the second, and the third research findings, that we would not be able to make any accurate judgment. So the amount of revenge that we apply is psychologically, to apply a fair amount of revenge is psychologically impossible. And on that basis, I would advise myself not to take revenge on others. Thank you.
Yeah, we go to the third question.
If we need a mediator, what type of characteristics would make a good qualified mediator?
Thank you very much for the question. I don't think I have the answer to that. There is this mediator qualification organization in Hong Kong, which would train mediator.
I mean, socially, not legally. It's socially.
Okay.
Mediator, a middleman, a middle woman.
Yeah, so a good mediator is someone first who has to be qualified. So even though
Socially, not official mediator.
In the social circle.
Yeah.
Social circle.
I'm afraid that we would not be able to find very good mediator among our friends. Okay. Now the reason being this: when we are in a big fight, when we are in great disagreement, like on these political issues, then all of us would believe that we are in the right. Okay. All of us would believe that we are believing and saying the right thing. And my friend is taking the other side. And I get a mediator. If someone who dared to be a mediator, and if I would respect that person to be a mediator, then of course I would respect this person to be a fair-minded person, right? But if this person is a fair-minded person, then would he always be agreeing to my position? Probably not. Now, if this person is a fair-minded person to me, namely, this person believes the same thing as I do, then this person would not appear as fair-minded to the other party. And so this mediator would be rejected by the other party. As a result, this mediator is no longer a neutral, impartial mediator, but this mediator is seen as an accomplice of this person, which means that the mediator is no longer mediating. The mediator is now in the fight.
So it's hopeless to find a friend to be a negotiator.
I guess to keep your friendship, it's better not to ask the person to be a mediator.
Okay, I think we have a question over there. Is the question still there? Is someone asking questions? No? Okay, yeah, okay.
Yes, it's a similar question than the previous one. So if I am the middleman, then how could I better facilitate reconciliation?
We realize the difficulty and challenge, but do you still have some tips? Someone may try to be a good mediator.
Allow me to share something which is more faith-based. Okay? I am not sure that we can ensure full reconciliation. But what I and a few Christians in the last few weeks have been trying to do is to gather people of different political pursuits and to tell them. Now, this may not apply to anyone in Hong Kong, because we gather them, we ask them that, hey, since you are a Christian believer, you believe in the same Jesus Christ, can we talk about things on the basis of something in common? And so the 7 of us extended our invitation to our friends and our friends' friends. So we found people who are very different. Okay, all of them would agree to sit together with another person. And then we gathered last week in a place which looked quite neutral. And there were about 50 or so of us. We split up into 8 groups. And using a short questionnaire, we have people who are strongly supportive of the police, and people who are very critical of the police, and people who are in the middle. And so in each group, there are 6 or 7 persons. And there was a facilitator. And this facilitator asked these people to sit in circles. And during that 90 minutes or so, these people would take turns to share. And we use a very structured format. We use a 4-3-3 format. In the first 4 minutes, each one of us, we take turns. So number 1 would talk about his or her feelings, her experience during the last few months, what those experiences are. And everybody would have to listen. Okay? And then in the next 3 minutes, during that next 3 minutes, people would just keep silent for the first minute or so, would reflect upon what they have heard from this gentleman or this lady, and then write down 1 or 2 responses, and then read out that response. So it has to be very short, a short sentence. So this is the 3, 4, 3. And then the 3, there's the last 3 minutes. We pause and we pray for that person. Okay? We pray for that person who gave that 4-minute speech. Not everybody are required to pray, but some of them who feel the desire or the urge to pray for that person did pray. And so that ended the 10-minute block for person A. And we do the same thing for person B, person C, and person D, until everyone in the group has spoken, has heard other people giving feedback, and been prayed for. So this is what we did last time. I was not a facilitator, but I was one of the participants. And I found that very encouraging, because in a very structured situation, we do not talk past each other. We do not argue. And there is a rule that this is not a discussion group. This is not a debate. This is a time to share and to listen. And at the end of the whole, and toward the end of the gathering, the minister conducted a Holy Communion, and we ended the whole event in a Holy Communion. The feedback we received so far is that people were excited. Well, I would not use the word excited. People were relieved to have a place where they could safely speak out and where they could be listened. And lo and behold, these people are in groups where they are assigned according to their answers to a short questionnaire, a questionnaire that would distinguish the yellows from the blue and from the not so yellow. So every group has some yellows and some blues, and they feel that they could listen to each other. And this was not reconciliation, but at least we're taking the first steps towards reconciliation.
So again, thank you for coming tonight. I hope and trust you do learn something, okay? Thank you guys, thank you.